After a crushing defeat, the indestructible boxer becomes a priest, but 10 years later returns to the ring.
Let's do this. Let's fight. You want to fight?
The movie begins in Houston in 1960. Young George and his family move into a new home, but it's in terrible condition. Even the electricity isn't working. That evening, their mother carefully divides a single hamburger into 4 pieces for the children. Starving, George is eager to eat his share right away, but his sister Mary insists they pray first. Reluctantly, he waits until their mother finishes the prayer. The moment she does, he devours his portion in one bite. Noticing that her brother is still hungry, Mary kindly offers him half of her own share.
I loved her for that.
Same night, George's mother sternly tells him that he cannot afford to repeat a grade again. Catching up would be too difficult, and she begs him to stay out of fights.
You promise me you won't fight.
The next day at school, George is met with sideways glances because of his appearance. During class, he tries to answer a question, but the teacher ignores him because of his dirty shoes. Instead, she calls on a student with polished dress shoes. During lunch, George sits alone without food, while his classmates enjoy their packed meals. One of them mocks George, pointing out that he can't even afford a piece of bread and starts treating him like a dog.
Go get it.
Furious, George punches the boy in his well-fed face. As the teacher approaches, he runs away. Years later, George and his friend loiter near a bar, looking for a victim. A drunken man stumbles out, and the 2 friends follow him to rob him. However, they soon realize that he's a police officer.
We're busy right here, huh?
A police car arrives, and a chase begins. George dives under a house. Moments later, a police car with a dog pulls up. George covers himself in sewage from a nearby drain to mask his scent. His clever plan works, and the police, along with the dog, drive away. On his way home, George notices an ad for a labor camp on the television in a shop window. The ad promises free food and drinks for those who have dropped out of school. The camp will provide professional training and assist with future employment, and on top of that, they'll even pay a stipend. Excited, George shares the news with his mother, telling her he wants to join the camp. She supports his decision, assuring him that he has more potential than he realizes.
Look at me. You got more inside than what you're showing.
A few days later, George arrives at the camp in California. At the entrance, a guard explains the rules to him. Inside, he quickly shows his roommate Desmond who's in charge. In his sports bag, George finds a new pair of Converse sneakers and a note from his mother, while Desmond looks at him enviously. George struggles with his electronics class, causing the other students to laugh. He silences their laughter with a stern look. The next day, Desmond listens to music, while George grunts over his homework. Annoyed, George yanks the plug out of the record player.
You always this pissed off?
When I'm trying to study.
Desmond takes a swig from his flask and offers George a drink, but he declines. However, during their conversation, they start to connect. George's mood lifts when Desmond invites him to the cafeteria. He's eager to wear his new sneakers, but to his horror, he discovers they're missing. In the cafeteria, Desmond advises George to report the theft to the authorities after lunch. He shares that, thanks to him, there are extra chocolate cookies in the cafeteria today. Due to his talent in mathematics, Desmond was put in charge of ordering food, and he adjusted the weekly orders, replacing beans with cookies. George notices a guy strutting around in his stolen sneakers. Seeing George's angry stare, the guy panics, runs away, and locks himself in his room. George kicks the door open and nearly throws the thief out of the window. Hearing the noise, Doc rushes in to break up the fight. Trying to justify his actions, George explains that his mother worked hard to buy those sneakers.
That boy stole my shoes. My mama worked hard to give me those.
In the car, Doc offers George 2 options: send him to jail or home. He gives him money for a bus ticket and drives him to the stop. George begins begging Doc not to expel him from the camp. Moved by sympathy, Doc decides to give him another chance. He asks if George has ever done any boxing. It turns out Doc is a boxing coach, and he realizes that the 2-meter-tall teenager possesses remarkable strength. He invites George to join his boxing club. George eagerly agrees.
You want to learn it?
Yes, sir.
The next day at the gym, Doc introduces George to his sparring partner. George reacts aggressively to his opponent's jokes, and Doc reminds him that they're not here to kill each other. George steps into the ring while an excited Desmond urges the spectators to place bets. When the sparring begins, George tries to land powerful punches, but his lack of technique makes him an easy target, and he quickly ends up on the floor, causing the crowd to laugh. Feeling humiliated, George walks off, and on his way out, punches the heavy bag so hard that it falls, silencing everyone. In the locker room, Doc reassures George, explaining that 6 months ago, his opponent was just as inexperienced as George is now. Doc assures him that with proper training, he can reach the same level. Frustrated, George complains that he's become a laughingstock, but Doc insists that he needs to ignore what others think and focus on his training. Doc begins to train George intensely, teaching him various boxing techniques and tricks.
There you go.
George struggles with coordination and footwork. Doc emphasizes that boxing isn't just about physical strength, but also strategic thinking. After a while, George calls home. At first, the conversation goes smoothly until he mentions that he's doing boxing, and his mother disapproves. Their conversation is suddenly cut short when George runs out of money for the call.
George?
Later, George steps into the ring again against the same opponent, but this time, the fight goes completely differently. In just a few seconds, George knocks him out, impressing Doc with his rapid progress. George visits Doc in his office and learns that Doc was a professional boxer who won his first 24 fights. George shows him an article about Joe Frazier from a boxing magazine and declares that he wants to become a world champion. Doc, finding his enthusiasm amusing, advises him to temper his expectations and explains how many trainings it will take before he can compete in professional matches. When George asks about the next Olympic Games, Doc tells him they'll be held next year and George won't be ready in time. So his first Olympics will be at least 5 years away.
5 years? I'll be an old man.
The scene shifts to the following year, at the Olympics in Mexico. George is now 19, and the commentators note that the guy has been boxing for only a year. He steps into the ring against a more experienced Soviet boxer. The commentators doubt his chances, while his family proudly watches the fight on television. As the fight begins, everyone at the camp cheers for George, even his mother, who, despite her negative views on violence, joins the children in front of the TV. George lands several decisive punches, easily winning the gold medal. His victory evokes mixed feelings in his mother, who struggles with the brutality of the sport, while George, thrilled, raises the American flag. The day after his victory, George proudly walks through his neighborhood with the medal around his neck. He runs into his former accomplice, who criticizes him for raising the American flag after the fight, especially when other black athletes stood with their heads lowered on the podium to protest racism in the United States. He accuses George of simply performing for the amusement of white people, when he could have used his name to speak out about black issues. Frustrated, George returns to his mother and pours his heart out, telling her how tired he is of his friends calling him a traitor. She comforts him, offering him dinner. George swears that he will win a professional championship belt to make everyone respect him.
I'm gonna win the championship belt, and they'll respect me then.
George moves to Oakland to train with the best. At the airport, he notices a beautiful girl reading a sports magazine with his photo on the cover. He strikes up a conversation with her, and her name is Paula. When her flight is called, she heads to the gate, and George desperately tries to get her phone number.
George, do I look like the kind of woman that stands around by the phone?
In response, she asks him to write down his number, slightly flustering him. He quickly writes it down, and as she walks away, he mutters to himself, "No."
No, ma'am. You do not.
At the gym, Doc introduces George to his new team, Dick Sedler, his promoter, and Archie Moore, a former light heavyweight champion.
The morning you wake up to fight for that championship, the air tastes different, the sun look different, and only 2 men on this whole earth matter, and you're one of them.
George begins his journey to the heavyweight championship, winning fight after fight. Under the guidance of his coaches, he prepares to face Joe Frazier. Meanwhile, Paula calls George, and they start dating. She becomes a regular spectator at his fights, supporting her boyfriend as he builds a record of 22 wins and no losses. Eventually, George and Paula get married.
Do you take this woman to be your wife?
You bet I do.
After his 36th victory, his trainers announce that he is now ready for the title fight. The big day arrives, Jamaica, the championship fight between George Foreman and Joe Frazier. George is considered the underdog, especially since Frazier defeated Muhammad Ali 2 years ago, and almost no one believes in Foreman's chances. In the first round, he takes a powerful left hook, but responds with strong body punches. Frazier lands another of his signature hooks, but just before the round ends, George delivers a crushing uppercut, sending Frazier to the canvas. The bell rings, giving Frazier time to recover. Unstoppable, George dominates the following rounds, knocking Frazier down multiple times until the referee stops the fight. George is declared the new heavyweight champion of the world. At the after party, George is met with applause as journalists shower him with questions and compliments. Amidst the excitement, his gaze falls on a girl who clearly craves his attention. George walks over to Desmond and offers him the position of his financial manager, acknowledging his talent in mathematics. Desmond agrees immediately, spilling his drink as George insists that he quit drinking.
It's a long way from the job corps, isn't it?
Later, George returns to his hotel room and finds that same girl in his bed. Despite feeling confused, he allows her to stay, and something unclear happens between them. Afterward, George feels uncomfortable, realizing that he has been unfaithful to his wife. The next morning, George comes across an interview where Muhammad Ali mocks him, promising to send him back to the ghetto with one punch. George is furious at these words. A few months later, George hosts a family gathering at his luxurious mansion, proudly showing his mother his car collection.
Now, each car has its own personality.
That's why you need 5 of them.
5? Where do you see my garage?
He's happy to see his daughter, but his relationship with his wife is noticeably strained. Before they begin the meal, his mother reminds everyone to thank God for the food.
God, I bought the food, Mama.
During the meal, his sister Mary announces that she's expecting a child, and Desmond shares that he has invested all of George's money in reliable stocks. Meanwhile, Paula steps away to answer a phone call and discovers that it's one of George's mistresses. She confronts him about it.
Woman, I got a $5 million fight coming up against Ali.
I dropped my life for you so that I could play seconds?
Oh, so you don't like this life now, huh? I give you everything.
I don't want everything. I want you.
And George can't even look her in the eye. George then travels to the Democratic Republic of Congo for his fight with Muhammad Ali. In this country, Ali is revered as a hero, and almost everyone supports him. At the hotel, George sees Ali entertaining a crowd of celebrities and journalists with jokes, mocking George.
His hands can't hit what his eyes can't see.
Now you see me, now you don't. George thinks he will, but I know he won't.
And claiming that sports journalists will regret making him the underdog. George approaches Ali.
George, we was just talking about a different fighter.
The crowd awaits his response, but he remains silent and walks away.
Well, if he boxes how he does interviews, this gonna be a short night.
I feel sorry for Ali. Foreman could put him in the morgue.
Due to Muhammad Ali's immense popularity in the country, the crowd chants the legendary phrase Ali Bamaye, meaning Ali kill him. Despite this, commentators suggest that after George's dominant performance against Frazier, Ali stands little chance of winning. When the fight begins, George takes control, landing several significant punches, while Ali tries to float like a butterfly, sting like a bee. Ali's constant taunts and provocations only fuel George's rage.
They told me you was bad, George. Let me see it.
Throughout the fight, George aggressively corners Ali against the ropes, delivering powerful blows. Ali showcases his defensive skills, periodically counterattack. However, George's aggressive style gradually depletes his energy, and with each passing round, he looks increasingly exhausted, while Ali remains relatively fresh. During the break, a wild Archie encourages George, urging him to keep pushing forward. Doc, however, is visibly concerned by their advice, noticing George's growing fatigue and slowed movements. By the 8th round, it's clear that Foreman is exhausted, and Ali begins to dominate. He lands several strong punches, eventually knocking Foreman down onto the canvas.
7, 8.
Ali wins the fight by knockout, handing George his first defeat. The crowd erupts in applause for their new hero, Muhammad Ali. After the defeat, George reflects on his life, realizing that he had been blinded by his aggression. He decides to make things right. He calls his wife and vows never to leave her again, but Paula asks him to sign the divorce papers. Seeking comfort, George visits his mother and confesses that he fired Dick and Archie, blaming them for his defeat. His mother offers him support.
Listen, I know you done had a hard time, but I can't stand to hear you talking like this.
Later, trying to prove his strength and regain respect, George decides to fight 5 boxers in one day. However, this idea seems reckless to everyone. Doc urges him to reconsider before it's too late. During the event, Muhammad Ali joins the commentators.
Heavyweight champion and world-class clown Muhammad Ali about to join me at the table.
Clown? Howard, don't get hurt now.
As the fights progress, he draws the crowd's attention to himself, and soon, the audience begins chanting his name.
Ali! Ali! Ali!
Frustrated and craving a rematch, George challenges Ali to a return bout, sparking an argument between them. Despite the distractions and tension, George finishes the event victorious, defeating all his opponents and knocking out 3 of them. After the fight, Doc enters George's locker room and asks what he hoped to accomplish by fighting 5 opponents at once.
Respect.
He advises George to return to facing 1 opponent at a time. Their conversation is suddenly interrupted by a message for George. He rushes to the hospital and learns that his pregnant sister Mary is bleeding and has been urgently hospitalized.
We need the best doctor. I'll pay for it.
We already got the best doctors, George. The baby needs a miracle. We need to pray.
While the doctors fight to save the baby's life, his family begins to pray. Shaken, George steps outside to pray. He asks God why he chose Mary's child, as she is the kindest person he knows. He begs God to take his life instead of the baby's. If anyone has to die,
You won't take somebody? Take me.
The next morning, George is greeted by his mother, and they go to Mary's room where they find her holding the baby. The child is healthy, and the doctors call it a miracle.
Say hi to your nephew, Lil George.
The George.
Yeah, Mama told me you prayed. Whatever you said to him, it worked.
In the next scene, George fights Jimmy Young in the ring and ultimately loses the match by unanimous decision. In the locker room, the coach scolds George, stating that he missed his chance for a rematch with Muhammad Ali. Overcome by a powerful heat stroke, George begins hearing voices.
Who said that?
Nobody said nothing, George.
Who said that?
He loses consciousness and collapses. When he regains consciousness, Doc informs him that they thought he had died.
I was. Jesus Christ is alive in me.
A few days later, George is baptized. Soon after, he speaks at the church, nervously sharing with the congregation how he found God. Noticing a woman in the audience who is listening intently, he calms down. He proudly announces his intention to dedicate his life to God and become a preacher, which surprises and shocks Doc. Doc is skeptical of George's sudden changes, suspecting it might be a form of showmanship.
You a fighter.
I'm not a fighter. Not anymore.
George then visits Muhammad Ali, who continues to joke around with him.
Tell you that found Jesus.
Congratulations, George. I did not know he was lost.
George admits that he was once so angry at Ali that he wanted to kill him, but now he seeks forgiveness for that bitterness.
I want to help people.
Well, George, help me to do is fight Kenny Norton one more time, knock him out. Please, George, knock him out, because I sure can't. You knock him out, he won't be a top-ranked contender, then I'll give you another shot at the title, and then we'll both get paid, huh? Praise Jesus.
George assures Ali that this is no joke, and after a heartfelt conversation, they reconcile and ultimately become friends. After that, George visits his ex-wife and children. He sincerely apologizes for his past behavior. During his next visit to church, George approaches the girl he noticed earlier and strikes up a conversation. She struggles to believe that someone like him, a former boxer, could truly become a preacher. In response, George takes the microphone and steps outside to preach, encouraging passersby to follow God. Despite some mocking from the crowd, he remains calm.
The Lord changed my life.
Was it the Lord who changed you? It was Jimmy Young. I seen him beat the hell out of you.
The girl watches him from a distance, impressed by his sincerity. Later, over lunch, she apologizes for her doubts, explaining that his reputation made her skeptical about his intentions. Now, seeing his true purpose, she introduces herself as Mary, and they begin to feel a mutual connection. George drives her to an old, abandoned church, sharing his dream of buying the building and establishing his own congregation. 7 years later, George's dream has come true. He is now preaching in his church. His wife, Mary, and their children support him. After the service, a woman approaches him with her grandson, asking George to train the boy, who has gotten involved with the wrong crowd.
Well, I'd sign up to train with Ali, but not the guy who lost to him.
George declines, suggesting instead that the boy seek guidance in the Bible. A week later, while playing with his children at home, George sees a news report about the boy being arrested for a robbery. He deeply regrets not agreeing to train him. George finds an old building that's perfect for a gym and asks his financial manager to purchase it. We see that Desmond is still struggling with his alcohol addiction. They renovate the building, and just a few months later, students are training in the gym. George hires several trainers and even dedicates part of the gym to a Muhammad Ali training center. However, a year after opening, during a training session, the electricity suddenly cuts off. The management company informs George that they haven't received payment. On top of that, Desmond hasn't shown up to work. Panicked, George goes to the bank and learns that Desmond invested all his money in high-risk stocks, which have now devalued, leaving his investment account with only $2,000. The bank threatens to seize his assets, including his mother's house. In a fit of rage, George raises the entire town to find Desmond. Despite his anger, George's mother pleads with him to forgive Desmond. Eventually, George tracks Desmond down in a bar. The accountant tries to run, but George catches up to him, nearly killing him in his fury. Realizing what he's about to do, George comes to his senses and forgives Desmond. To save his financial situation, George agrees to star in a sauce commercial and begins selling merchandise. Despite all his efforts, his wife Mary informs him that they are still far from solving their financial problems.
Short.
Well, how short?
Not even close.
When the bank starts seizing his assets, George falls into a depression. He finds his old boxing gear, trying to reconnect with his past. He admits to Mary that he asked a friend to read the upcoming sermon for him, feeling that he can't tell people how to live when he has lost everything. He wants to return to the ring, but Mary is against it, fearing that his anger might return along with his old profession.
There's only two things I know how to do. That's box and preach. And preaching won't pay the bills.
George turns to Doc, asking him to train him again. Initially, Doc is opposed, reminding George how much it hurt him when George left. He mentions how Joe Louis tried to make a comeback and how Marciano nearly killed him.
Joe Louis tried to start at the top, but we'll start at the bottom.
They'll call us a circus act.
But not if we keep winning.
However, George convinces him, repeating a phrase that his own trainers once told him.
The morning that we wake up to fight for that heavyweight championship belt, oh man, the air's gonna taste different. The sun, that's gonna look different. And only two men on this whole earth is gonna matter. And we'll be the both of them.
Hearing this, Doc's eyes light up. He says that first George needs to lose weight, and then they can begin training. Motivated, George struggles to fit into his old training gear.
I think my gym clothes shrunk.
He starts working out with his son.
Hey, George, take it easy, man. You're gonna have a heart attack.
The training is tough, but Mary unexpectedly supports him, helping him stick to his diet. After several months of hard work, George successfully reaches his target weight and returns to Doc, ready for full-fledged training. During a sparring session, George lacks speed and stamina, struggling to keep up with his opponent. Doc says they'll work on new techniques to improve his performance. In the middle of the night, Mary wakes up from a prophetic dream. In the morning, she tells George that the Lord spoke to her in the dream and showed a vision where George wins the heavyweight championship again.
He's gonna lift you up in the middle of that ring, so you'll lift him up in front of millions of people.
Before his fight, in the locker room, Doc advises George to awaken his old anger, but George insists on approaching the fight with a clear and calm mind. George steps into the ring against Steve Zowski. He admits to Doc that he is afraid to take off his robe in front of all these people.
Last time they saw me, I looked like Superman.
So now you look like the Michelin Man. This ain't no beauty contest.
The spectators immediately notice that George has gained some weight, but the men actually appreciate that he now feels more relatable to the common people. When the fight begins, George acts too calmly, even holding back his anger when Steve hits him after the bell. In the second round, George starts to dominate, leaving Zowski with no chance. Seeing that his opponent can no longer resist, George demands the referee stop the fight.
Stop the fight!
News of George's triumphant return spreads quickly, as no one has ever come back after such a long hiatus. After an impressive streak of 24 victories, 42-year-old George Foreman faces reigning champion Evander Holyfield in a bout dubbed the fight of the century. Despite his desperate efforts, George loses by unanimous decision from the judges. After the fight, George heads to the bank, where all the employees greet him with applause. Though he didn't win the match, he is pleasantly surprised to see a $12 million payout from HBO for the fight. Despite this financial success, he tells Mary that his work is not yet finished.
Maybe I heard him wrong.
You heard him right. He did his part. We have to do ours.
3 years later, Michael Moorer defeats Holyfield to become the new champion, making George the #1 contender once again. At 45 years old, no one believes he stands a chance against the 26-year-old Moorer, who boasts 30 knockout victories with an undefeated record. Moorer is also the first southpaw heavyweight champion in history.
How can you beat that man?
During the fight, Moorer dominates the early rounds, and George struggles to keep up. Everyone at his center, including his mother, watches anxiously, cheering him on. After the 9th round, his trainers suggest throwing in the towel.
9 rounds against the best in the world. There's no shame, son. No shame.
However, in the 10th round, George lands a devastating right hand, sending Moorer crashing to the canvas. Against all odds, George Foreman wins the title, becoming the oldest heavyweight champion in history.
He did it. Thank you.
Thank you.
The scene then highlights how, at 45 years old, George reclaimed the heavyweight championship 20 years after losing it. He and Muhammad Ali became close friends, speaking on the phone almost daily until Ali's passing. In 1998, Charles Doc Broadus was inducted into the International Boxing Hall of Fame. Today, George continues to preach at his church and run a youth center in Houston.